Islam in Cuba can be briefly divided into three phases. The first two no longer exist. The third one is what we're talking about now. The first phase, from 1500 to 1900, Muslims did exist as slaves. But because the Cuban government does not allow the types of research that is allowed here, we don't really know much about them. We know there were Muslim slaves, as they were here in America, as they were in South America. There were Muslim slaves in Cuba. But like all of the slaves, they weren't able to protect their religion, so Islam got lost. But we have some notion that there were 5%, 10% Muslim slaves in Cuba. All gone. The second wave of Muslims from Cuba is when Cuba became independent until Fidel Castro's revolution, from 1898 to around 1955. Those 50 years, 60 years, around, we estimate, because we don't have statistics, because right now the government is not allowing research, so we don't have the numbers. But what we do know is around 2,000-3,000 Arab families came. We don't know whether they're Muslim or Christian, what percentage. We can estimate 50-60% Christian, because majority were Christian, and maybe 30-40% Muslim. Because most Arabs that came to Cuba were Maronite Christians from Lebanon. But still, a good percentage were Muslim. We have anecdotal knowledge. We don't really have recordings of this because we don't have research yet the government allows us to do. These few thousand Muslims, they were the first Arabs to come to Cuba, and they founded Arab associations. There is Arabic architecture. I took a few pictures as well. They built their houses in Andalusian style, in Arabic style. They do have Arabic calligraphy in their houses. I saw it with my own eyes. This is from 1898 to around 1950. There were many wealthy Arab merchants that came, and they lived there in this semi-independent time frame. However, sad reality, the Muslims of this time frame did not build a single masjid. They did not start any Quran school. They didn't preserve their religion. And so when Fidel came and banned religion, those Muslims that remained, they were not able to preserve Islam to their next generation. And that immigrant Islam completely dissipated. There is no remnants of it left. I asked, where are the descendants of these people? They quoted me some famous names. There are some singers, Estefan, I don't know who they are, and these are, his grandfather was this and that, but they're not Muslim anymore. Around 50,000 Cubans, a modern Cuba, their ancestry is Arab. Around 50,000. 0 are Muslim to the best of my knowledge. I asked multiple people. I went to the masjid. Nobody has heard of any of them. They've lost Islam completely. And it's a big reality. I've spoken about this multiple times. When the Muslims migrated, the first batches that came to Americas, by and large, they lost their faith. Here in America and in South America. Why? Because they didn't build masjids. They didn't build musallas. They didn't build Islamic school. They didn't make tahfield. So the first generation were Muslim. And I read a paper in an academic journal. I was doing my research in this, that in the 70s or 80s, a ethnographic researcher came across a tape recording, listen to this, of a Syrian immigrant, an Ottoman immigrant, who had recorded in the 1930s or 40s the adhkar of the janazah. So that if somebody dies, they can play this recording over the janazah when they put them in the ground. So for the next 30 years in Fidel Castro's time when religion was banned, they would have this cassette recording that anytime somebody died, there is no salah, there is no jumu'ah, there is no Quran, but they know he's a Muslim. So when he dies, they would take the cassette recording and they would just play it and put the body in the ground, and that's all they can do. In the 60s, in the 70s, that Islam is completely gone. So then where is now Islam coming from? There has now been, alhamdulillah, a resurgence beginning from the 80s and 90s. Where did this resurgence come from? These are the ones we met. Where did it come from? Two sources. Number one, from the 80s onwards, Cuba started inviting people to study in their universities for PR, for getting relationships, especially for the governments that are not in good ties with the Western lands, the quote-unquote third world countries back in the day. So Cuba opened its doors for students to come study engineering, medicine. Apparently, Cuban universities are very good. They don't get paid a lot, but apparently the universities are very good for Latin America. And their medical schools apparently are amongst the best. And they're free because it's a socialist country. And so Cuba began bringing students from Muslim African countries, from certain Arab countries, for 10 years, Pakistan also had a relationship with Cuba. From 1991 to I think 2001, for 10 years, Pakistan had hundreds of students coming for medicine. So for the first time, Muslims came to Cuba only as temporary students. They were not allowed to live there. They had to study and go back. But during the time that they're there, what's going to happen? Interaction. So people began interacting with Muslims, seeing Muslims. This was the first batch of interaction, and people began converting. Another group from the Cuban people, they worked overseas. They got jobs in America. They got jobs. I met one of the converts. He worked in the Middle East. He worked in, I think, Bahrain or someplace. And so he converted over there and he came back. So another batch goes overseas and comes back. And the third batch, the most bizarre, subhanAllah, they discover Islam on their own, cut off from the rest of the world. And I met quite a few of such people, and this is where the Iman really it's truly phenomenal. I want to tell you some of the stories of the people that I met. So I prayed, there's only one masjid in all of Havana. Cuba has 11 million people. Muslims are probably less than 2,000-3,000 realistically. That is less than 0.03 or 4%. One of the smallest percentages I have ever visited in my life of Muslims. Extremely small. In all of Havana, Havana is one of the largest cities in all of Havana. There is a small musalla, less than 1/4 of the size of Epic. It just opened up 7-8 years ago. With help from the Turkish and other governments, they paid some money for this. And even that musalla was majority empty. For Jumu'ah, I would estimate there was probably less than 150 people. In Havana, for Jumu'ah, less than 150 people. Of them, perhaps 60% were students, immigrants. There were a few businessmen and a few ambassadors, or the foreign delegations that are there, working in the embassies. 60%, 40% were converts. 40% were converts. And this is in Havana, one masjid. Can you imagine other cities which are smaller, how many people will be coming for Jumu'ah? So in the entire island of 11 million people, 11 million, how many are praying Jumu'ah, subhanAllah? It's really something that it was very, I've hardly been to a country where the percentage is so small. But when you meet these people, these converts, amazing stories. Let me tell you a few of these stories. So we met Brother Enrique, who was in his late 70s, early 80s. Brother Enrique was involved in the revolution of the 60s. He was now a very old man. Brother Enrique said his first introduction to Islam came, he couldn't speak English, he was speaking to me in Spanish. His first introduction to Islam came when he was involved with the revolution, and he took inspiration from the Black Panthers in America, and he read the autobiography of Malcolm X. In the 60s in Cuba, as a young man, he reads a Spanish translation of Malcolm X's autobiography. And he said, I wanted to be a Muslim ever since I read that book. And I was thinking to myself, Malcolm X never, ever met this person. He has no idea, and yet his legacy, his inspiration has reached all the way to Cuba. And a man who never met a Muslim in his life decided in the 60s, I want to convert to Islam. I asked him, when you never met a Muslim, how did you know? He goes, I just read this man's biography and I said, this is what I want to be. But I didn't know anything about Islam. There's no book allowed about Islam, no Quran allowed in Cuba, no literature, never met a Muslim. So then I said, how did you convert? So he said, I kept on finding more research. Then Muhammad Ali became my role model. So for 10 years, I'm following Muhammad Ali. Because of him, he became a professional boxer, a professional MMA fighter. Because of Muhammad Ali, the inspiration. Then he became a trainer. Cuba then assigned him to train people to become professional fighters. And in the 80s and 90s, people would come from overseas to be trained under him. That's where he met his first Muslim. From African countries coming to train MMA, and he says, I saw a copy of the Quran. I jumped on it and said, where'd you get this book from? He goes, I'm a Muslim. He goes, tell me about Islam. And when he met the Muslim, he knew he had to convert. From the 60s till the 80s, he hadn't met a Muslim. But he said, in my heart, I knew I'm a Muslim. Subhanallah. He doesn't know what the Shahada is. He doesn't know what the Quran is. He doesn't know Salah, but he knows he's a Muslim. Simply by reading Malcolm X's, when he reads the Quran, he embraces Islam, and he doesn't even have any masjid. There's no masjid in the 80s and 90s in Cuba. This is Brother Enrique, we met him. Another brother who I wanted to meet, but I didn't know he passed away. I heard about him before. He passed away during COVID. He was a professor of religion, and his name is Imam Yahya, Sheikh Yahya. He's called Imam Yahya. He didn't study Islam formally. By the way, Cuba does not have a single scholar from Cuba. Not a single hafiz of the Quran. Subhanallah. Can you imagine 11 million people and nobody trained in Islam? Who leads the salah? These are the students who come. You know, there was the imam there, he was from Niger. He was from Niger. He had studied in the madrasas as a child, and now he's studying engineering. So he's there for a few years. He's the imam. I said, what's going to happen when you leave? He goes, I don't know. Somebody's going to take over. I mean, he cannot stay there. It's not, he's not Cuban. He's there studying engineering. When he finishes, he's going to go back. But in the meantime, he's the one leading the salah and taking charge. He's not actually Cuban, but he has to do it because that's the role he's been assigned. SubhanAllah. There's not a single sheikh on the island. And it was just amazing for me. How can you survive? How can you? But subhanAllah, here they are. I wanted to Sheikh Yahya. I didn't meet him. I met his wife. I thanked her on our behalf and whatnot. Sheikh Yahya was a professor of religious studies. He was a Christian. And when he studied religion, by studying religion, he came across Islam. And on his own, again, without meeting any Muslim, on his own, he converted to Islam in his office. SubhanAllah, just you hear about these types of people, and I wish I could have met him, but he passed away during COVID, Allah yarhamu. But he was the most active Muslim in the 80s and 90s, and he passed away, as we said, 2 years ago. And I was told by his wife, by other people, that when it was illegal, he would open his masjid, his house for Jumu'ah Salah, 2, 3, 4 people in the 80s and 90s. He would get a farm. Sometimes the police would come and raid it. Sometimes they would jail because it's illegal to pray in that time frame. But this imam would, we call him imam, as you understand, he's not trained as an imam, but out of respect we say Imam Yahya. This imam would, in his own house, have the Jumu'ah for a decade. Then when his house got exposed, he hired a farm outside, and they would go there to pray. And I'm just like amazed, the iman of the people there, praying when it is not allowed to pray. It's illegal to pray, and they're doing this. So Allah Azza wa Jal, give him Jannatul Firdaus for all that he has done. He has passed away, but he was giving da'wah, and there's video footage of him. You can see some of the video footage on YouTube. Another person that we met there, we met was Brother Ibrahim, a Spanish Cuban, Cuban convert who converted 25 years ago via the activities of these same brothers, Imam Yahya and others. And subhanAllah, his story, again, just like what we saw today with the conversion. He said, I converted after 2001 when the incidents happened. I converted, my whole family rejected me, but I persisted. I would wake up for Ramadan every single day. I know I had to fast, wake up for suhoor, and after the first Ramadan, on the day of Eid, my wife gave me the best present ever. She said, I want to convert too. And she said, why? She said, any faith that causes you to wake up and fast every single day has to be a true faith. 1 month of Ramadan, and she converted on the day of Eid. Then he told me, after a few years, his mother also converted. And then his brother converted. And then 3 of his cousins converted. Alhamdulillah, from this one brother, 10 of his family members converted. Alhamdulillah. This is how slowly but surely Islam is spreading.